It's now my pleasure to introduce an Executive Vice President at Wells Fargo. Please join me in welcoming Peter Grebley.
Well, first of all, Diana, thank you for letting me follow Josh. That's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to this piece of the program. By the way, Josh, just so you know, I had an experience too. My son just got his learner's permit. I think you know what I'm talking about. So, you guys know where I am. By the way, I love these teleprompters. They're great. They do not match the voices in my head, but they absolutely have some good script to them. So, hopefully we'll have a good time. As Melissa stated, I am with Wells Fargo Bank. Some of you may have heard of us. We've kind of been in the news lately. My goal over my lifetime is to make it so we're that last 5-minute human interest segment instead of the first 5 minutes of the news. And if you had the opportunity to hear what that 5-minute segment was all about, it would be about the people of Wells Fargo. It's a company, but it's made up of people. There are 7,000 colleagues of mine here in San Francisco. There's 15,000 in the greater Bay Area. We're your coaches, your volunteers at the schools, at churches. We're the ones that are involved in the community, cycling to fight against AIDS. We're the ones that are walking to raise awareness about juvenile diabetes, about the Red Cross, about the Heart Association, and others. Those are the things that my colleagues and I are a part of, and that's what makes Wells Fargo the organization that it is that you don't get to hear about. At a corporate level, there's a number of things that we're doing as well. I'm proud that we are very focused in on starting the businesses. Start, run, grow, and succeed. That's our focus. That includes diverse small businesses. Through our diverse community capital program, Wells Fargo committed over $100 million in lending capital and grants to community development finance institutions for the next 3 years. Some of the local CDFIs that we have provided grants to through this program include Meta, Opportunity Fund, and Working Solutions. I also want to let you know that we just announced that we have donated $3.25 million to the Butte Strong Fund to help Paradise and the surrounding communities recover from the devastating Camp Fire. $2 million will help. Thank you. $2 million will help people staying in shelters find stable housing. $1.25 million will supply micro grants to infuse working capital back and help businesses reopen. That's our community. Now it's my privilege to introduce Wells Fargo economist Michael Pugliese. Michael is an expert in fiscal policy, U.S. and international interest rate forecasts, macro commentary on major foreign economics. He will help us understand the impact that federal government shutdowns have on our economy and whether Bryce Harper is worth $300 million. Please join me in giving Michael a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So I'll tell you right now, I'm a Philadelphia Phillies fan, so he's only worth $300 million if we sign him. So let's set that aside for now. Again, I'm Mike Pugliese. I'm an economist here with Wells Fargo. I want to thank you all for having me today and spending a little time to talk about the impact of government shutdowns and what that means for our economy. I also want to thank you for not immediately canceling your registration when you saw there was going to be an economist speaking this morning. So thank you again for that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the shutdown today, and my hope and my goal is to leave you all with some answers to the questions of how on earth does the government of maybe the largest and most powerful country in the world just shut down? And what does that mean, right? I mean, why is it that you have some workers that get paid and some workers that work but don't get paid, and you have some other workers that maybe work and don't get, they don't work and they don't get paid? And why are some agencies open and others not? And why did the stock market go up during the shutdown? And all of these other questions that maybe you've seen on the news and you've been paying attention. Maybe you haven't seen that the shutdown was going on, in which case I commend you for having a much healthier level of news consumption than I do. But I'm guessing most of you are aware that we did have a shutdown over the past, call it month and a half. So with that, let's kind of dive right in. So when we're talking about a government shutdown, what we're really talking about is about the third of the government that is called discretionary spending. That's the money that's appropriated on an annual basis. So that kind of big piece of the pie right there, the mandatory section, that's Medicare, that's Medicaid, that's Social Security. Those are the checks that just automatically go out and aren't budgeted on an annual basis. You take that little section up there that's interest, and that leaves you that 30% or so of the federal government that we call discretionary. And about half of that is defense spending, and the other half's a lot of the programs you associate with the government. So maybe the IRS or the EPA or a lot of those other agency-type programs. Now that's about $1.3 trillion still, even though it's only about 30% of the federal government. That's about 6% of the economy, so not nothing, but also we're talking about pretty big numbers in terms of what we're looking at when the government shuts down. But it gets a little bit messier than that. So every year, Congress has to pass 12 appropriation bills. And they're supposed to do them all separately, but sometimes they do them in mixes. They might do 2 at a time, or 4 at a time, or 8 at a time. They might do 2, 2, 2, 2. Well, this year what we happened to have was we had 5 pass before the shutdown began, and 7 that did not. And those 5, they amounted to about 75% of that discretionary pie that we were looking at earlier. So it was a little odd. It was kind of like a partial federal government shutdown, where you've got one segment of the pie we're concerned about, and then of that, another 75% that's actually open. You're starting to see why this is so confusing and why it's maybe hard to get the full story when you just look on the news and catch the 60-second segment. Now, what about the macro impact first? I mean, what is the actual impact of the federal government shutting down to the national economy? Well, the important thing to remember is the national economy is big. The US economy is about $20 trillion. And when you look at direct federal employment, it's actually only about 1.5% of total employment in the US, so that's about 2.2 million people. That's a lot of workers, but the simple fact of the matter is it's about 98.5% of people are not working directly for the federal government. So that's maybe why a shutdown happens, and it's odd, right? It almost seems like people are ignoring it. The stock market maybe doesn't move a whole lot. There aren't significant disruptions for the majority of people. It's why it seems like something that should be a huge event sometimes just kind of gets shrugged off. And that's why from a macro point, you don't always see it in the data. Yeah, maybe the economy slows down a little bit in that quarter and it's a little stronger the next as there's folks get back pay and the economy gets back to where it was. But generally speaking, the data kind of look through this. Now that's the challenge on a macro scale, but that doesn't tell you a whole lot about the micro impact, right? I mean, sure, 2.2 million might only be 1.5% of total employment, but that's still 2.2 million people. And we can think about this a lot of different ways. I've only got 10 minutes, fortunately for you all. They made me use 7 slides, so I promise we're not going to go on forever. But think about it from 2 standpoints, right? You could think about it geographically, where you've maybe got some areas that are pretty significantly exposed. Well, what jumps to mind? Well, one's Washington, D.C. That greater metro area has almost 400,000 direct federal employees. Now, that's obviously a lot. There'd be a big geographical impact there. But that still means that you've got 4 and 5 federal workers that are working somewhere outside D.C. It impacts all communities, not just the area in Northern Virginia and Maryland and the area we associate with the government. And then drilling down on an even bigger micro, or on an even deeper micro scale, this chart takes some data from the Federal Reserve and says 4 in 10 Americans, if they were faced with an unexpected expense of $400, would either have to sell something or borrow money to pay for that. The chart just takes the flip side of that equation. It says who could meet it. And it's improved some, right? In line with the improving economy, 50% of people said they could meet that $400 expense back in 2013. We're up to 59% now, 4 or 5 years later. So I mean, that's encouraging, but still think about that. 4 in 10 Americans would have to borrow money from friends or family or maybe a financial institution or sell something to meet that unexpected expense. And now you're talking about a 35-day federal government shutdown where something on the ballpark of 800,000 folks were not paid. And then obviously it took a little bit longer after the shutdown ended for those checks to finally be put out. That's a pretty significant micro impact, be it on the workers themselves or the businesses or communities that rely on those individuals and their incomes. It's a pretty scary thought. And it goes beyond the direct impact, right? It's not just people who work for the federal government and what that impact is on GDP or the jobs data or pick your economic data point. The tax situation is another really common one right now. I think we all knew maybe this tax season was going to be a little more challenging given that we had the biggest tax rewrite in the last 30 years. And the IRS, under the Treasury, was one of the agencies that got caught up in this shutdown. And so we had, for the most part, most IRS employees weren't working for the better part of January and not doing that prep work that goes into the refund season and the tax filing season in February, March, and April. Now, why does that matter? Well, about 80% of the year's refunds go out in February and March. And for a lot of folks that see a big refund, right, this could be the biggest financial event of the year. Now, it's still really early. Obviously, the government has reopened, and we could potentially have a deal coming that would prevent it from shutting down again on Friday. But so far, refunds have been going out a little more slowly. We only have 1 week of data. So I know there's been a lot of headlines in the news about refunds are down and returns are down by 30%. And I would caution a little bit. We only have 1 week worth of data so far. So hopefully they catch up and things get right-sized a little bit. But this is still a real risk, right? $200 billion goes into consumers' pockets in February and March. And what happens if either the shutdown we've already had or the shutdown that could potentially happen post this Friday starts to impact that? This is just one of many of the indirect things that can cause challenges, cause disruptions, cause problems when you have this extended federal government shutdown like we had previously. And then the final thing I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about is the debt ceiling. This is another one of those things that you've probably seen in the news, you've heard about, maybe you're vaguely aware this is a challenge. And it's really, it's almost like a Where's Waldo type thing with the debt ceiling sometimes, right? It just seems to pop up and disappear at random, and you never know when it matters or when it doesn't, and there's a hard deadline and there's a soft deadline. Well, the basic idea behind the debt ceiling is that is the limit on how much money the government can borrow. And so when the government is running a deficit, which we currently are, it has to borrow money in order to finance all its spending obligations. And so if the debt ceiling isn't lifted when you're up against that, you're no longer able to borrow money to meet all of your obligations, all your liabilities, and then you're insolvent. And that's why the debt ceiling can be such a challenge. There's sort of a two-step process where you've got the hard deadline when the debt ceiling is reinstated, and then the Treasury can kind of use these extraordinary measures type things to stay solvent for anywhere from 3 to 6 to 8 months. It kind of depends on the time of year. But then past that, the government's no longer to meet its bills. And that's why the debt ceiling can be so disarming and so concerning for financial markets. So if we think back to that big issue we had in August 2011 when the US sovereign credit was downgraded, you can see we saw a significant decline in consumer confidence. It was about a 50% decline over a 4, 5, 6 month stretch there. In 2011, we went right up against the deadline. You saw almost a 20% decline in the stock market over a span of, call it, 2 weeks or so. It's a pretty scary thought, right? I mean, the US government is really large. Treasuries are the risk-free rate for all financial markets. We're the biggest economy in the world. Everything is benchmarked to treasuries, and suddenly there's a question of, is this super safe asset truly safe? If the government has to start prioritizing, well, we can't meet all of our obligations, so maybe the Social Security benefits get paid and the interest on the debt doesn't, or vice versa, or some other combination. That's a pretty concerning thing from a macro standpoint, even though on a more micro level, it almost seems very abstract and obtuse and something we really shouldn't be all that concerned about. And you see this in the uncertainty aspect of it. This is a really well-monitored common index of US policy uncertainty. And it's just trying to measure how much uncertainty is there out there when it comes to the federal policy, be it policy from the Fed, policy from Congress and the White House on fiscal policy. You can see that the all-time high there, this chart goes back to the 80s if you can't quite see, peaked around that August 2011 debt ceiling impasse. What have we seen over the past couple months? It's skyrocketed, for those who can't see. I mean, we're way, way up once again. We don't have the February data yet, but in December and January, it really picked up. So what are some key takeaways there as I wrap up? Well, from a macro standpoint, right, I think every shutdown is different. It depends a lot on what the administration does to ease the impact of the shutdown, how many of those appropriation bills have been passed, which ones were passed, because they're all different in relative sizes. And then the flow down there of how many people are furloughed, how many are not receiving pay, how long does it take for that back pay to come, And then all of these indirect concerns, be it federal government contractors, geographic challenges, the tax season, the filing issues that I've highlighted, and then drilling down even deeper these micro concerns when you've got some pretty serious financial security challenges for some folks in this country, and what that means when they're going a month or more without pay. And keeping in mind that it's not just the DC area that's impacted. You've got almost 2 million federal workers outside the DC area spread throughout communities all over the place, including right here in San Francisco. So hopefully that answers some of the questions or concerns or issues that you might have around the federal government shutdown, and hopefully I didn't bore you too much with my econ speak and my slides. But thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the program today.